So welcome back, everyone, to the R2Kast number 3. So far, we've had the Ethical Butcher, we've had the chairman of RSABI, and now today we've got someone I would say it's got the coolest name I've ever heard so far, and a very cool interest as well. That's Jim Pantaleo. So just, you there, Jim?
Yes, sir. Wallace Curry, how are you?
Very well, very well. Pleasure to have you on. And as you'll hear from Jim's voice, he's not from Scotland. He's not from England. He's actually from the he's from is it Canada or the States you're from, Jim?
Southern California, my friend.
Southern California. Don't want to cause a battle there.
That's right, where the palm trees sway and everyone's beautiful. Just kidding.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, we were talking just before we started recording this, and I'm sitting here and there's sort of almost a blizzard going on outside, and Jim says, he's just been out with his good lady for a lovely walk in the sun, 60 degrees, so that was lovely to hear.
Yes.
But I'm just going to quickly, talk about the elephant in the room. There's no video here, it's just audio, which for everyone watching the podcast or listening to podcasts on like Spotify, Breaker, Radio Public, Google Podcast, Pocket Cast, that sort of thing, that won't be a major issue. But if you're watching it on YouTube, there's not really going to be anything to see. Just going to have to sit back and listen, unfortunately, because Scotland, California, we're having a bit of a bandwidth issue, and we'd actually started, and we found out we weren't actually in the same room together, so Jim got kicked. So started again, just audio. So yeah, thank you for coming along. And I just want to quickly ask, there's been quite good viewership on these so far. I really want to keep pushing them. I think it's good for you guys to meet people in farming, people in agriculture across the world. And if you guys could just subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow Spotify, that would be great. And also jump onto Facebook and Instagram, Rural to Kitchen pages, and just follow me there, and you'll be updated for what's happening. And also, if you've got any ideas for folk you want to be on, get in touch with me, and I'll try and make a lot of them happen. Who we have, as I said, obviously we've got Jim today, and what Jim's here to talk about is vertical farming, which we'll get into as we go on. But first off, Jim, tell us a bit about yourself. Who is Jim Pantaleo? What's your history?
Yes, Wallace. So I am, as I mentioned, Southern California guy, and my history has been, in terms of my work history, I spent 20 plus years, about 25 years in technology. About half of that with the large, well-known technology company, Hewlett Packard. And when I hit a certain age, about 6 years ago, I sort of had a talk with myself, and I wanted to pursue something else besides technology. And I stumbled upon indoor vertical farming, so growing food in this particular case, using only LED lights in fully controlled environments. So whether that's a container or, in my experience, warehouse growing, it came upon me in the summer of 2014, and I spent an entire year investigating the nascent industry of indoor vertical farming, reached out to every person that I could who was credible, whether they were an operator of indoor farms or an academic at any of our universities. I went to conferences, and did as much as I could to learn and immerse myself in the subject. And in fact, after that first year in the summer of 2015, I got my first 3 pro bono gigs that I did remotely. And one of them was actually with Intelligent Growth Solutions, who, as you know, is on the campus of the James Hutton Institute in St. Andrews. And that was with Sir Henry Ackroyd, who was the founder of it. And I don't believe Henry's associated with IGS anymore, but IGS, hopefully, as your listeners will learn, are doing great things in Scotland. Fast forward, after that first summer and those pro bono gigs, I eventually got a job at an indoor farm here in Southern California. And over the next 2.5 years, I did everything from, business development to actually being a farmer in the farm, to ultimately running it as the general manager. During all this time, though, I was sort of expanding the network and writing. I wrote for Urban Ag News, which is still a very good online resource for indoor farming and controlled environment ag. That's Urban Ag News. And then also got involved with hosting and organizing a number of conferences, several in Panama, the International Congress on Controlled Environment Agriculture, and then also the one I'm still involved with here in the United States, which is Indoor AgCon, which is a gathering of indoor farmers each year in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, the last few years we've had to postpone because of COVID. But what am I doing now? I am holed up here in Southern California. I'm not on a farm at the moment, but I am working on behalf of a few really cool entities, that being the University of California, which is involved in a collaboration with the Dutch government, and we're all about accelerating technology in the space and how the UC can help, as they've done for over 100 years with California farmers, as we know. I'm also involved in a very unofficial way as an ambassador to industry for NASA and their crop science group at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And then finally, I'm consulting to a number of multinational companies who have technology and products that they'd like to get into the indoor vertical farming world and are trying to enter that market, if you will. So I'm still in the game, even though my real goal in the future, if you will, is to get back to a farm and get back to plants and people. But that is what I've been doing for the last 6+ years, and it's really been a blast.
Great to change that from HP into vertical farming.
Yeah, big change.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely that sort of technical, advanced side to both of them, but totally different industries. But yeah, I mean, that just shows sort of the thing. You know, we hear in farming, it's an industry that you can't go into if you're not in it. And albeit it has its barriers and it's a tough industry to get into, I think you're living proof there, Jim, that it doesn't need to be that you've only ever worked in tractors and with cattle before to mean that you're going to be able to get into farming.
That's absolutely right, Wallace. And when you look at disciplines in modern farming or indoor vertical farming, you know, you name it, whether it's engineering, computer science, automation, robotics, biology, et cetera, there's always transferable skills. And again, I was no spring chicken, still ain't, but there's always a chance. So yes, amen to that.
Yeah, it's funny you say still ain't the spring chicken. I hear it's not the type of thing that comes back to us. Yeah, it's true, and you know, I've got quite a lot of young viewers, maybe not young, but young to the extent they're looking at choosing a career and whatnot. And it's a trying time. You know, education puts a lot of pressure. You know, schools and whatnot, that you have to know what you're doing exactly, and the truth is you don't. And yeah, so it's good to hear that. Yes. But you know, we've been talking about vertical farming. We've mentioned it for a minute or so now, and we've just sort of used it as a word, and a lot of the people listening might not really know what that is. When I studied my masters at Glasgow Uni last year, I focused on a few sort of different things in farming, entomophagy, sort of the prospect of eating insects and that sort of thing, and vertical farming and precision agriculture. And I focused more on the entomophagy and precision agriculture and never really got to focus heavily on vertical farming. So I've got an idea of what it is and sort of know the fundamentals of it. But what would your description of vertical farming be for the viewers, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just as the word is used, vertical meaning stacked produce, if you will, or a stacked grow system where your produce can grow up vertically, if you will, and that could be anywhere between 10 feet high to 20 plus feet high. And the key thing that I use, and again, it's semantics, but indoor vertical farming is in a total controlled environment, no natural sunlight, and photosynthesis occurs only through the use of LED lights. Of course, we use liquid nutrients and or, you know, various methodologies of delivering those liquid nutrients, and we use the words hydroponics, obviously. We use the word aeroponics, which is a misting of, if you will, of those liquid nutrients upon the root structure of the plant. Or aquaponics is another word we use, which incorporates the use of fish for fertilization as well as a secondary crop. And so I know it's a big word, but indoor vertical farming is growing food and or other plant matter, cannabis, etc., using only LED lights, liquid nutrients in a fully total controlled environment atmosphere, or agriculture, obviously known as TCEA. Everybody knows CEA, controlled environment ag. The T is total controlled. So that's how I really try to define indoor vertical farming, is that no natural sun, fully controlled environments. Again, think containers, shipping containers, think warehouses, etc.
Yeah, brilliant. Couldn't have summed it up better myself, obviously. And the sort of the idea of vertical farming's always been in my head, the idea of making acres, making hectares. So where you've got a space in a warehouse of, say, half an acre, then if you put 6 levels of that, you've got 3 acres. So if that puts it into a simpler term for you guys without
Absolutely.
the big ones.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that, Wallace, because our first farm was 1/8 of an acre, but when we did the mathematics based on the stacking or the vertical nature, our yield was equivalent to 16 acres. So just the example of stacking.
So you had 80 levels. You must have had 80 levels.
We had roughly 20 levels, but we were in a quarter acre or an eighth of an acre footprint, and it went up about 20 feet in the air. And so when you flattened all that out, your output or your yield was the equivalent to 16 acres. So it really is a commentary on space and space saving, stacking, yield, etc.
So what I take from that is the actual yield of a specific area is higher than that specific area in a field. Am I picking that up right?
Well, what you're doing is you're saying, if I took this field and I parsed it out and layered it on top of each other, there is your equation of how much yield you're going to get. So just in your mind's eye, look at your field, parse it out into, maybe eight different plots, and then stack those on top of each other. And there you go. Of course, the key thing to remember on indoor vertical farming, beyond being stacked, is that you have what we coin the term closed loop system. Where you have a closed loop system, you don't have runoff. Therefore, your water savings, as you've heard many times, are extraordinary over field farming. And the figure has been used of upwards of 90+% savings of water over field farming, which is a very fair number. And folks, obviously, you'll see transpiration happen, and of course the uptake of the plant itself, and how the plant, of course, uptakes the liquid nutrients. But when you think about water savings and that resource, indoor vertical farming, of course, ticks off a lot of boxes in that area, Wallace.
So is it a completely circular, I can never say that word, circular economy? There's no losses, and no gaseous losses, no liquid losses, nothing. There's completely and totally, I guess you've said, totally controlled.
You certainly have losses, and again, the word transpiration is like a plant sweating. So, you, of course, there are methodologies to recapture that, which of course it turns into humidity. You want to ensure that your humidity levels are good. There's some technology out there that can recapture. It's called atmospheric water generation. Think of what we call here in the States a swamp cooler, where you have the ability to capture moisture in the air. And in this particular case, an atmospheric water generation system in an indoor farm can go ahead and filter that water, and then you could use it and drive it back into your system. I've actually been a part of some beta testing of some atmospheric water generation systems, whereby we were able to capture about 120 gallons of water a day and drive that back into our system, which was actually about 50% of our daily water for that particular system at that particular time of growing. So there's some really cool technology out there in terms of environmental controls and how one does control the environment.
Oh, that's good. I'm sitting here like a kid on Christmas Eve, or to be honest, like myself on Christmas Eve. And just from a British viewers, 120 gallons is in the ballpark of about 515 litres.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, maths and conversions like the only thing I'm up on.
Well, we tried to do it in the 70s in the United States, but we're too damn lazy. So sorry.
You still use that confusing imperial system, but it doesn't matter. We work in ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. You guys work in like 4,844s per acre. Oh god, nightmare.
Yeah, but you've still got a famous song. 500. That one famous song. Forget those guys.
Yeah, you're right.
The two brothers. Now, why didn't they call it 500 kilometers?
Because that's not as long. The idea of 838 kilometers doesn't have the same ring to it, I don't think. But no,
that's a fantastic song, by the way.
It's a good one, and I must just quickly say to the listeners that this is not an ad for the Proclaimers.
There they are. That's right, the Proclaimers.
Not a paid ad. Yeah, no, good stuff. It's great actually. I love listening to tech and whatnot and how it all works, because I mean, I'm not a computer guy. If you guys could see, I say this every day, if you could see my setup for running this podcast, I've got 2 folders with some books and my iPad sat on top. So technology and all that fancy stuff is not my forte, so it's really cool to hear what is out there. I just wanted one more question before I moved on. You talked about liquid nutrients. What nutrients are they? Is that your NP and K, or are you
absolutely putting in 100%, Wallace? Absolutely. So all your essential nutrients that, again, depending on your crop, because some crops actually need a little bit more or a little bit less of something. But yeah,
for sure,
absolutely. And that liquid nutrients can actually be augmented by other things. Like what I and others refer to as a tea brew, where it's a conglomeration, if you will, of worm castings, molasses, sea kelp, but just a rich biological soup, if you will, that can also be added to your dosing system, if you will. But lots of different ways to do that, and of course, we talked about aquaponics, and I am not a pro with aquaponics, but there must be extraordinary care taken with aquaponics to mitigate any foodborne pathogens, and that's we talk about E. coli and salmonella, and those are areas that the growers must take extreme care. Of course, there's another pathogen called listeria, and listeria can often be found in the gills of fish in large aquaponic systems. So there's a lot to it, and it's a balance. It's art and science, and but ultimately, as one would always say, indoor vertical farming is not an answer to outdoor farming. Rather, it's a supplement, and it could answer some of our challenges, whether that's food miles and carbon issues, or hyper-local food growing where people live, in other words, in major metropolitan areas, etc. And so you'll see all that as being a big push behind what's happening. And of course, when you think about COVID, Wallace, it pulled the curtain back on food security and supply chain challenges around the world. And so fresh produce and food for people is paramount and essential, as we say.
I like that quote. I like that quote about outdoor farming. That's cool. One thing I've just realised I've not actually touched upon is when you were talking about nitrogen there, it was running through my head, like if you integrated legumes into what you had, would you be able to fix nitrogen that way? And then I realised we hadn't actually talked. What crops do you grow with vertical farming?
Yeah, good question. So, for the last 10 years, five and a half years since I've been in it, and years before then, really is the leafy green culinary herb crop. And of course, on the cannabis side, you do see major grows of cannabis. But in terms of food production right now, and there are some reasons behind it, having to do perhaps with light and photosynthesis and the biology of a plant in order to go through its all the phases of it. If we're talking, for example, about fruiting plants, which is becoming a possibility in a very real way, and I'll touch on that. But when we talk about leafy greens, we're talking about lettuces, again, culinary herbs, basil, etc. next phase of this life, this world of indoor farming will be about growing fruiting plants. And when we say fruiting plants, we're saying, again, no natural sunlight, only grown under LED lights, and things like strawberries and peppers and cucumbers, etc. And of course, the big story now for your listeners to Google is the current or recent partnership between Plenty, which is the very large, well-funded farm here in California, and Driscoll's Berries. Driscoll's are a global berry company, if you will, and they're based here in California. This is all public, of course. They just signed a $150 million partnership agreement for Plenty to work on growing strawberries in their indoor farms. And so that's a wonderful threshold for us to come to. Certainly that takes money. There are some stories, though, Wallace, that I can share with your listeners, that there are some farms that are growing fruiting crops indoors, and I'll give the great example of Oishi Berry, Oishii Berry in New York City. They're growing strawberries that are examples of a Japanese-style strawberry grown in the highlands of Japan, where they have very cold nights and mild days, but those strawberries are $5 a piece. And they're not cost comparative, but they are doing it. So to your question about what crops can be grown, right now it's leafies. In the future, it'll be fruiting crops. We need to get there, and we will get there in terms of LED lighting and, again, environmental controls and how you manage the biology of a plant to have a true leaf and then a flower, and then, oh, by the way, introduce a pollinator. And then after the flowering, you have your fruit. And of course, Oishi Berry has a neat YouTube that if your listeners go out and look at it, they'll not see, but they'll hear how Oishi releases bees into their containers so as to pollinate the strawberry plants. So all very cool, all new, moving forward in the future, and again, we'll get there.
Yeah, that's cool. I knew about the greens and whatnot, and I have heard cereals grown for the stock to be eaten as or for cattle to eat as a green stem. Not heard much about it, but I've heard about it.
Fodder.
Yeah, berries I was unaware of. That's interesting. It's quite crazy actually that they can do that, and I watched a team of guys here on Arran, actually, the island I'm from, I was telling you about, Jim, called R2Kast, do quite a lot of cool work about sort of sustainable production and whatnot, and they did this film night on basically the transport of bees, and it was something I'd never even considered, and then you've obviously mentioned it there, so yeah, good stuff.
Yes.
The idea of growing lettuce and sort of just growing it and it's ready, and you mentioned getting rid of food miles, and I was thinking, well, how could you do that? But I realise now supermarkets could almost have their vertical farm as part of the building, and then there's no need to sort of bring in lettuces and that sort of product that can be grown in this system.
Absolutely.
From any further than about 20 yards.
Yeah, and you're seeing that now, my friend. You're seeing supermarkets procure containers, have their produce man or woman manage that container, if you will, as a grower. You're also seeing companies that are putting grow units into stores, and then I'm speaking specifically about InFarm out of Germany. And InFarm, of course, not only do they have those units in the buildings, but they also have farms nearby that are indoors that can provide fresh product into those units. And they're like, large glass encased, I don't want to say kiosk, but they're in store, if you will, now. So you're seeing that kind of movement.
And I mean, yeah, you can't. I can't see a fault in that, apart from the only potential emissions given off by vertical farming. Like that's the emissions that's given off if however many, are surely mitigated by the diesel emissions from transport. So that's got to be a massive.
You know it, absolutely. Hyper fresh, as they say. Hyper fresh, hyper local.
Hyper fresh, much like myself. So we've talked about sort of what vertical farming is, and you actually mentioned there, Jim, you weren't an expert on aquaponics, more sort of focusing on hydroponics and that sort of thing. But could you give me, you've obviously mentioned, and quite a lot of us know, that aquaponics involves fish. Could you sort of say how that works, though? How that transpires into reality, I guess?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So imagine you have a very large 500 plus gallon tank or several of those. You purchase fish like tilapia or others, and ultimately you're able to, and from a process perspective, take the effluents or the fecal matter and allow that to be incorporated into your dosing system that goes back into the plant, to the point where those are how you're feeding. That's how you're feeding your, and then so ultimately you have that modus operandi of feeding a plant, but also ultimately you're getting two crops. You're getting a veg, and then you're getting a protein, because of course you'll have to cull those fish as they procreate, etc. And so, but I want you to know this, is that in this world of indoor farming, yes, they talk about aquaponics. It's not ubiquitous, although I would point your listeners to a good farm here in the United States, in New York, in Brooklyn, called Upward Farms. They're the former Eden Works, but they just changed their name to Upward Farms, and they got a nice new round of funding. They're focused on aquaponics, and they're going to be doing good things. But think also about the other 2+ methodologies. So hydroponics obviously is the most ubiquitous, where you'll have ebb and flow or deep water culture, again, where your roots will hang in the liquid, or the liquid will be moving by, so it's constantly touching the roots. Again, an aeroponic methodology, which the most famous version of that is through Aero Farms in New York and New Jersey, and their methodology of growing, which is how they'll seed a tarp, if you will, which is made out of recycled plastic bottles, and then below that tarp, when your root structure starts growing, the roots will be sprayed with a mist, a nutrient-laden mist. And then so there's your 3: hydroponic, aeroponic, aquaponic. I like to always say there's one more, because this, in fact, is how I grew at my first farm, and that one more is drip irrigation, where the plants actually would come around on a track on the ceiling. Think about like a dry cleaners, your shirts that would come around, and they would stop at a lighting station and go through about 60 feet worth of lighting. And then they would actually stop completely at a watering station, where spigots would come out, drip water into a channel on the carrier, if you will, where the plant was, and then the plant would uptake that water through a series of channels in its tray. And so that's your typical drip irrigation. It's not hydroponics, it's not aquaponics, it's not aeroponics. So it's all just semantics and methodologies, but those are your basics, if you will, Wallace, in terms of how folks are growing indoors now. Yeah,
and I've learned something there. I never even considered drip irrigation there. Yep. Obviously hear about it in circular systems and sort of outdoor agriculture, especially in Africa and stuff like that. But interesting. So I guess we've sort of covered what vertical farming is, what sides of it there is, what it can do, what it can't do, that sort of thing. But there's one thing that stands in the way of a lot of people getting into it, and that's, as you guys would say, dollar, pounds over here. It's not cheap, I assume, but say I wanted to set up a cabin, right? Just one of those containers you guys are talking about. What sort of initial investment would I be looking at?
Yeah, so if you were to purchase one already constructed and ready to rock and roll, those can be anywhere between $60,000 upwards of $125,000. There are a handful of these container builders, at least here in this country, and I could name off a few right now. I'd hate to get in trouble with anybody in terms of me being an endorser, so I'm not endorsing anybody, but I will rattle off a few names. So clearly, Freight Farms in the Boston area, Freight Farms, they're doing very good work. Growtainer in the Dallas area. Urban Crop Solutions out of Belgium, Urban Crop Solutions. And then the folks at Sanon Bio just started something called ARC, A-R-C-H, I think, or A-R-C. Sanon Bio, S-A-N-A-N-B-I-O. And they're a Chinese headquartered company with offices in Europe as well as the U.S. So there are those folks that are building those with my friend Trip Williamson, Cropbox out of North Carolina. So you got a lot of those guys. But let me say this, if I can, Wallace, about starting small, because and I've dropped these names plenty: Bowery Farming, Aero Farms. These are multi-million-dollar, large-scale operations. I would recommend that if folks want to start this, listen, you can get a container and do some of your own work, actually, or I mentioned the numbers, but also just a small space that might be available to you, and small space being, and help me with the meters here, anywhere between 1,000 square feet and 5,000 square feet. Nothing massive. And I like to give an example, a real world example of a company that started very small. That example is, I consider him a friend of mine now, and I really appreciate his story. His name is Dan Albert. Dan Albert, a number of years ago, along with his wife, started a little indoor farm in their backyard in a shed. And that shed was probably 200 square feet, 300 square feet. Help me with the meters, Wallace. In
so
that,
100, I'll just say 1,000 square feet, give or take 93 square meters. So
there you go, my friend. So relatively small, obviously small. He spent maybe $3,000 or $4,000 on some lights, and maybe $1,000 or $2 on some nutrient film technique NFT trays, if you will, gutters and trays. Excuse me, not 100% sure of the actual system he had, but long story short, Dan started growing microgreens in this little shed in his backyard, and he was able to create some marketing and some packaging, and he would walk around to Seattle restaurants. And in a year's period of time, he had over 50 customers. And over a 2.5-year period of time, he ended up selling farm box greens to one of Seattle's and the West Coast's largest, most robust produce distributors called Charlie's Produce. They're a multi-million-dollar produce distributor in the Northwest. Dan moved the farm from the shed to the Charlie's Produce campus. He actually was able to exit about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And that is a wonderful story of how one can start small, organically create a great customer base, and then in this particular case, get bought out by somebody larger. And Dan, by the way, worked there for a while and kept his title, and then he's now doing something else. But so those are great examples of starting small. So I'd always want your listeners, absolutely 100%, Wallace, to know that they can start small and grow from there, literally and figuratively.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, maybe if anyone wants to buy this podcast, I'm willing to talk. No, I've just come up with a wee name when you were talking there for a vertical farming company. What about Vertigrow? Maybe that's already taken.
I believe Vertigrow is taken.
Oh, I'm so proud of that. I was thinking it must
we're in
be taken.
Italy, or where is Vertigrow? They're somewhere.
It must be. Anyway, yeah. So there's definitely costs involved, but if you're willing to start small and take the time to build up, that possibility is there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, much like anything really. I mean, we have this idea of vertical farming and the sort of aero farms and the likes. You look at it and it's like this golf course of a building, just full of tech. Like that's not how you have to start.
No, and that is happening now. But there's a lot of capital that comes into play. And not that, listen, if depending on anyone's taste for risk and or capital in terms of access to, lack of, or access, it all depends. So, but I would say this, Wallace, is that indoor vertical farming is not for the faint of heart. You absolutely must be surrounded by smart people and a lot of key sort of roles, if you will, in terms of smart. You need a good plant physiologist. You absolutely need a great grower. You need good assistant growers. You need a great crew. Every area of it is not unlike any business, where you need great people that'll always, in my humble opinion, always move any business forward. People are it. People and plants.
Yeah, absolutely. I would throw animals in there as well, but that's a competitive audience for you.
There you go.
No, I follow a lot of sort of stuff like this on social media and YouTube and whatnot. And one thing that caught my eye last week was the brother of the recently named richest man on the planet, Elon Musk, is looking at going into vertical farming, which made me really think, what's the future of vertical farming? Like, there's been these fantastic changes lately over the last decades and whatnot, but what do you see happening for vertical farming in 20, 30 years?
Yeah, so not only is Kimball Musk, Elon's brother, thinking about going into it, but he is in it, and he's been in it for many years. In fact, he's the co-founder of Square Roots, and Square Roots is in Brooklyn, and they are a container farm that is a series, I believe, of about 10 containers, and it's run by Square Roots farmers. I think they either lease that space or something, and they do great work. Their CEO is who I consider an industry friend. That's Tobias Peggs. And so Tobias, who's actually from the UK, and Kimball Musk have done good work and are attempting to, again, bring controlled environment ag to the US. So to your point, where is it? So here it is, and I want you to think about it like this. So we have, we in the world, we have supply chains, and there's supply routes, and there are those that supply, in this particular case, fruits and veg. And where do they supply it to? They supply it to major retail locations and other large distribution centers, so those retail locations can, be a part of the supply chain. So here's the example, and it's happening now, and I want to lay it out there. And so I'm going to use the example that may or may not be popular. Walmart is our world's largest retailer. Everybody knows that. In the United States, I believe there's roughly 47 Walmart distribution centers. If you think about supply chain, and quite frankly, I know this for a fact because Walmart has made these moves and has had and has personnel that are working towards this. And this being, Walmart would like nothing more to have help with their supply chains near their distribution centers, to the point where some of the SKUs can be provided, some of the leafy greens, the bagged salads, clamshells, herbs, etc. Some of those SKUs that may have to travel miles and miles and miles. So if you think about it, and here's the great example in reality. There is an indoor vertical farm, which actually is a glass house, so it's got supplemental lighting and it's indoors, but it's got natural sunlight too. It's in Cleburne, Texas. Cleburne, Texas is 50 miles south of Dallas. They're called Eden Green Technologies. Eden Green, E-D-E-N, Green Technologies. They are literally 2,000 feet from the Walmart distribution center in Cleburne, Texas. They are involved in providing that disty center with different branded name products or other products. They're not selling it under their name, I don't believe. But that is an example, Wallace, of how farming can go to where people are, but also can go to where those disty centers are. And I believe that in the future, you're going to see indoor farms set up shop near these hubs of distribution and tie their horse to the wagon of a Walmart, a Whole Foods, etc. let us not think too much further even about the last thing I said, which is Whole Foods. As you may know, Bezos Expeditions and Jeff Bezos do own Whole Foods. Bezos Expeditions is also an investor in Plenty. And as I mentioned, Plenty's, their first farm is in South San Francisco. They're expanding to Compton here in the Los Angeles area now as we speak. Plenty is probably about 10 miles from the Whole Foods distribution center in Emeryville, California, which is just across the San Francisco Bay from where this farm is. So that play, if you think about Whole Foods, and oh, by the way, they have a farm, and that farm's just about 10 miles from that Whole Foods Disty Center. That, I believe, is part of how this is all going to play out in the future. Whether it's a major retailer or even further, Wallace, major beverage manufacturers, if you will, Bolthouse Farms, Odwalla, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, all those guys have various brands and SKUs, if you will, of green drink or other kinds of beverages where the inputs, if you will, could be everything that's grown in a farm like spinach, kale, alfalfa, barley, wheatgrass, etc. So think about this, the supply chain from a beverage manufacturer to their inputs, their ingredients, and how an indoor farm can play in that space. So the future is hugely wide open, and these are just a small example of how I believe supply chain and distribution, etc., can be met.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, but superstores, and even before that, shops, even before that, just plain old farmers markets looked at bringing the food to the consumer, but we're now trying to bring the farm to the consumer. So
exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Yeah, it's really cool. Really cool. So I mean, Jim, we've chatted there for probably about half an hour or something like that. Really interesting. I could chat all day about vertical farming and all entailed, but I think you've covered everything very comprehensively, and what I'll do is I'll make sure to, if you were happy with this, if anyone had any questions that they put through to me, I could pass on to you and revert those questions back at some time. But
absolutely.
People that have watched the podcast, listened to podcast, and listened to my sort of people in farming interviews that I did before the podcast was a thing, know that no one yet is able to have got away without telling me what would their tips be for anyone going into the industry, which you've kind of covered, but maybe you could give us a succinct answer to that one. And also, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's ultimately about who you are as a person and what you feel your gifts are and what you want to give to this world. And I know that sounds esoteric and possibly even cloaked in religiosity, and I don't mean to do that, but we all have a purpose, and for each person that's hearing my voice right now, you've got to know what your purpose is. And then ultimately, it's like anything, and you've heard this a million times, if you find that purpose and you know you love it and you're passionate about it and you know you're helping yourself and the world and your family, your friends, your environment, your community, then you'll do it for free, and you'll do it because you love to do it. And ultimately, I think every human being wants to get to that point that they could, and I don't think about the money, but that you can make money and out of something that you absolutely love. And oh, by the way, you're really helping the world too. So that's my message on that one. But I would say, where do I see myself in 5 years? I'm so lucky to have had the experiences that I've had. I want to continue to build on the relationships with the University of California. I would love for California to at some point have a indoor ag center of excellence, if you will, as led by the university. I would love to continue my relationship with NASA and to see things like the moon outpost come to fruition, and how we're going to feed and grow plants on the moon first and then Mars, of course. And then I love, as I've mentioned, plants and people. To be around plants and people, to me, is really critical, and I want to grow real old around plants and people. So I'd love to also at some point be back on a farm, if you will, wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go talk to plants and people. And so that's really where I kind of see myself in 5 years, Wallace. So I just really appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today. And I hope that if anything, you and I together have inspired some people to do something different. And God knows, you look out the window right now, ain't going to be any sunshine in Scotland for a day or three. So, go indoors, turn on some LED lights and grow some plants and have a good time with it and sell it to your neighbors.
Keep rubbing in the weather thing there, Jim. No, it's so what to take from that, for those of you that are listening, is Jim basically wants you to do a job for him for nothing. No, I'm joking. That's so true. I mean, the job I'm in as a lecturer is the sort of idea of going in is not I'm going in to make money. It's genuinely the love of the job. And you're right, if you can find something and that happens to be vertical farming and you feel that way about it, then there can't be a better tip, really, can there?
No, sir.
No, and you thanked me there. Thank you for coming on. It took Jim and I, about 45 emails to try and work out what time we were going to do this. I'm like, so what time were you at? He told me very confidently what time it was, and then 2 days later he was like, "You sent me the wrong invite," and I'm like, "I'm sure I haven't." But we got there in the end, and yeah, as you say, hopefully post-COVID, whether it's in Scotland, California, or elsewhere, we can meet up and have a beer together sometime or something like that, and that would be cool. Try and really chat about this more in depth. But if you've anything else to say, fire on, Jim.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I am half Irish. We say Éireann go bragh, Ireland forever. Y'all say Scotland forever. What do you say? What's your rallying call?
Well, it's technically Alba go Brath, but I mean, I don't really know, to be honest.
Because you're from Wales.
Yeah, well, exactly. But if you wonder why Jim's saying that, I'm pretty sure my name's Welsh for foreigner, but I could be wrong. I mean, it says that on Google. I know nothing about myself, like.
Well, Wallace, I appreciate you very much, my friend. You stay well, and I appreciate it, and I'll look forward to listening to the